Welcome back to The World This Week with me, Phil Rees. Well, the controversy over the film The Innocence of Muslims comes amidst the US presidential election campaign. Of course, when President Obama arrived in the White House in 2009, he promised to recalibrate the United States' relations with the Muslim world. Many of you may recall his celebrated Cairo speech. It was called at the time a new beginning after 8 years of George W. Bush's reign. Well, the promise of a new beginning was soon dismissed by most Muslims as the war in Afghanistan and drone strikes peppered parts of the Islamic world. However, since the Arab Spring, some have seen an emerging partnership brokered by countries such as Turkey and Qatar between the United States and the constellation of Islamic movements related to the Muslim Brotherhood. Remember that the Muslim Brotherhood was once seen in the United States as a stepping stone to Al-Qaeda. So how will this film affect that tender relationship? What's more, this film plays into Egyptian politics. The election of a Muslim Brotherhood president has riled many Egyptians, some of them secular, some of them Coptic Christians. Now it's an Egyptian Coptic emigre living in the United States who supposedly made the film. So was it an attempt to play into Egyptian politics and the fears of the Coptic Christians? Well, to discuss these questions, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Altikriti, the president of the Cordoba Foundation. Now, Seumas Milne, the associate editor and columnist for The Guardian, remains with us. And on the phone, we have Dr. Sara Silvestri, senior lecturer in international politics at City University in London. Well, Altikriti, will this film, in your view, damage relations between the United States and the Islamist groups that blossomed, obviously, with the Arab Spring and democracy?
Well, I think the first thing that needs to be said is that everyone in Egypt, including the Copts, actually came out and denounced the film. And I think that's a very, very important step. Actually, if anything, the divisions that politics brought were actually sort of dispersed or became far less as a result of the film, because everyone came together and denounced it. Now, people obviously reacted in different ways, but the overwhelming reaction, either in terms of the statements of the main religious bodies or in terms of the overwhelming majority who protested peacefully, I think was commendable. Do you
think there was an attempt to provoke, though, these sectarian views by these people in California?
Of course. I mean, as you put it in the first segment of your program, the very cause, the very objective of the film was to provoke, insult, and to make absolutely sure that the image that was sort of it was dispersed. The old image of the Arab barbarian, the savage, the reactionary, the person who is bent on violence, that was dispersed by the Arab Spring, that proved another character, a totally different character, someone who is hell-bent on peace and changing through peaceful means, someone who is entirely democratic, someone who is pluralistic, someone who is willing to share and join with others and change with others. That person in South California seemingly wanted, through this, pathetic production, to actually return us to the old image. So that was the very intention, and to an extent, that provocation, got the kind of response that the producer wanted on some levels. But in terms of the relations between the Islamists and the Western world, well, that relationship is still being cemented, and it's still being in molding.
Well, let's just stick to Egypt for the moment and keep that a little bit for later, because I want to bring in Dr. Sara Silvestri here. I mean, do you think, in a sense, that this film that what actually is playing out is not simply a question of the West and the Islamic world, but that some minorities, Coptic Christians, obviously in Egypt, are very worried by the growth of the new Islamism and democracy in the Middle East?
So you're talking to me now, yes?
Yes, indeed.
I think it's quite inaccurate to generalize now and try to establish the camp of the Copts versus the Muslims. I think this event, this sad event, and the production of this film was produced in the US and was produced by a particular person who has some personal grievances, some biased mind, and I would quite...
Yeah, but he was an Egyptian Copt. I mean, you know, you can't get away from that.
Yeah, but you know, you cannot start generalizing about Coptic people in the same way as people have wrongly generalized about Muslims until now. So we've slowly we've educated the public to start decriminalizing the mindset of the public in relation to Muslims, and now we shouldn't be now going down the route of trying criminalizing Coptic people in general. I do obviously agree that it does play, what he has done does play with the concerns and with the issues that are problematic among the Coptic communities in Egypt and around the world. And I'm very sad to hear that someone has been deviously using these grievances and these issues in order to provoke such dreadful events all around the world.
But I mean, Seumas Milne, of course, you know, Christians have been, you know, in Iraq as well, certain, you know, voices of concern there amongst the Christian community that are feeling that, you know, the new Middle East, perhaps they were happier under dictators. I mean, is there any sense of truth in that gave them they regarded as more defense for their faith?
No, I mean, I think the disaster for Christians in the Middle East has been the impact of repeated Western interventions, invasions, occupations. As we saw in Iraq, the Christian communities in Iraq have been devastated by the invasion of Iraq and the occupation of Iraq by Britain and America and others. That's also happened in Palestine. You know, that's happened across the region. So I think that's far more the problem that it's caused for the Christian minorities, and that's inflamed the situation for minorities in general. I mean, I would say more broadly that's also the situation with regard to these films. I think that the missing part of this picture is that, you know, why is it possible in the Middle East in particular to arouse people to such a pitch of protest and anger over what seems to outsiders as really a very minor provocation? And I think that's because it's seen in the context of what's been experienced in the region.
It's kind of pretext, in a sense.
Well, it has to be seen in the context of this experience, which is experience of decades of war, intervention, support for dictatorship, occupation, drone attacks, relentlessly across the Arab and Muslim world, coming from the United States and its allies. And this is continuing to this day. I mean, regardless of the attempt to hijack or commandeer the Arab Spring that's taken place in the last year and a half, which is obviously you know, a process that's going on, and I would say is largely failing.
Well, before we come to that, and again we'll touch that on in a minute, I mean, it's fair to say, and as Altikriti, that, you know, perhaps 200 years of, you know, manipulating Muslim societies, corrupting their leaders, trying to steal their resources, controlling the Islamic world. I mean, do you think that kind of Westerners who are looking at these sort of demonstrations can understand the impact of that?
No, because our sense of history is somehow curtailed by many elements, you know, our education, the media and the such. And when you speak to an Arab, when you speak to a Muslim generally, the sense of history is extremely deeply ingrained, and that's where the disparity emerges from. Also, this is something that yourself and Seumas touched on in the first part of the program about criticism of religion. You see, the thing is that if you're equals on the table, criticism is acceptable. When you're not an equal on the table, criticism comes across as a deep offence and insult, and that's where the problem lies. We're not talking here about a film. We're not talking about riots that ended up in the tragic killing of an ambassador. We're actually talking about power dynamics. And unfortunately, the Muslims, generally speaking, whether they be in their own lands or whether they be as minorities living elsewhere, have been for far, far too long, have been unequals, have been people who have been subjugated, who have been tormented, have been oppressed and the such. And therefore such insult, which in a well-established Christian or Jewish society, criticism or humour or the such or sarcasm can be taken in their stead. It's somewhat different on the Muslim level simply because of this inequality in terms of the power dynamics.
I mean, let's bring in, I mean, Sara Silvestri there. I mean, obviously you're an academic, you're aware of the history. You heard Anas Altikriti there say that, you know, the kind of the Western public isn't aware of this. I mean, why is that? Why is this kind of blank?
I actually would like to come back to what he was saying, because in a way, yes, it is true that the Muslim and Arab world has been subjugated by the empires and colonies and so on. But at the same time, with all the events that are going on now in the Middle East, with all the consequences of the Arab awakening, I would actually have expected a more responsible reaction, a more less violence coming from such an event, such as the production of this film, simply because nowadays Muslim societies have finally got access, after the dictatorship, have got access to news, to information, censorship has been banned, and so they should have access to a more neutral channel of information that should, diminish the biases and the feeding of anger and of stereotypes that the dictatorship were feeding to them. So in a way, I do agree and disagree with...
Well, okay, I mean, Anas, when we put that to you, in a way, they should forget the past a bit now. They've got a new future. They've got ability to control their own destiny now. So let's put the past to one side.
Well, actually, I mean, just coming back to what Sarah just said, the overall response has been, far more positive than the media has actually shown us. Obviously, people will capture the images and the stories of the burning buildings and the killing of certain people. But on a general scale, if we were to compare this with what's happened in the aftermath of the Danish cartoons and definitely Salman Rushdie, actually the response has been extremely, positive and quite commendable on many levels. I mean, the statements that came out calling for calm, calling for a positive, constructive response to this kind of, spit in your face, poke in your eye kind of insult was far and wide, and therefore the response was actually quite positive. However, at the same time, we mustn't forget that, as Seumas put it, the West's meddling, the West's intervention is still there. I mean, just because we had the Arab Spring doesn't mean that the past 2 centuries haven't happened. We need time for things to change and to transform.
The meddling has ended. And I think, maybe we'll turn now to the next issue, which is, in a sense, the West's relationship to the Muslim Brotherhood and to Salafis. And of course, the whole question that was brought up about the killing of the US ambassador in Tripoli, was this something that was organized by Al-Qaeda or other groups? And I mean, Seumas Milne, I mean, is this this whole area is quite an intriguing one, isn't it? Both the relationship between Salafis and the Muslim Brotherhood, and indeed more radical elements like Al-Qaeda in that pot. Now, the United States, in a way, has been courting the Muslim Brotherhood in recent years, hasn't it? And accepted the right of them to be democratically elected.
Well, it's sort of been pushed and pulled by reality, I think, to try and come to terms with what's happening on the Arab street and in the countries where there have been the most successful uprisings. And it's also trying to, reposition itself in a region where, which is for it highly strategic and where it's got a massive domination and presence. And in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, which were effectively pro-Western dictatorships, and where its position was knocked out of the picture very quickly. It's been scrambling to re-find itself and use the uprising in Libya to reposition itself. So I think that's more how I'd see it. But of course, you're right that the competition between political forces and religious groups within the Arab world in the aftermath of the uprisings and in the process of them is key to how some of these events are played out.
Do you think the United States is trying to manage Islamism in that way, though? It's trying to create a friendly Islamism that it can deal with and sort of, be able to maintain its security interests while actually recognise that Islamism is a very important part of these societies.
Yeah, it's trying to come to terms with the reality, in the political reality that's emerging, and trying to find its place in that, and to try and steer and channel the anger and the desire for change, dignity, democracy in a direction that will be helpful for it. And I think, from the point of view of the people of the Arab world and the region, who have faced with what we've been talking about, the invasions, occupations, drone attacks, intervention, support for dictatorship, I think there's a huge amount of skepticism. You can see that in opinion polls in the region about the intentions of the United States, and that's why, whenever these issues arise, people's anger about that comes out in lots of different ways. And of course, people can manipulate that, different political and religious forces can manipulate that. But I think you shouldn't take away from that underlying reality, which is an absolutely, prime and dominant part of the modern world, that the United States and its allies have tried to control this region in a way that has not happened to any other part of the world, and the result has been disastrous. And one of the the positive side of the Arab uprisings is that we're beginning to see people in the region take control of their future, and of course that's being contested in practice all over the place.
Yeah, and of course one shouldn't forget that countries like Bahrain, the United States has taken a very different policy to that in Egypt and Tunisia. Anas Altikriti, I mean, of course this film was shown on a Salafist channel in Egypt, and of course they had a significant amount of the votes. How do you see that dynamic playing out in terms of their anger against the West, which is much more explicit than, say, the Muslim Brotherhood, which has been, I think most people would say, walking on eggshells in terms of expressing foreign policy initiatives, particularly in relation to, say, Israel?
Well, it's quite an interesting set of dynamics. The actual airing of the film itself was something which could be questioned. I mean, the
Arabic showing of it
exactly
on a Salafist channel.
For it to be shown when at the time or before that there had been barely a handful of people who had seen it on YouTube. Now we have more than 50 million people who have seen it. So many questions have been asked of that particular channel and that particular presenter, and the wisdom of airing the film and starting or instigating this cycle of events. But in reality, the fact is that the majority of people in Egypt, whether they be part of the Islamic movement, the Islamists if you like, or whether they're the secularists or people who are watching on the sidelines, or the leftists or whoever, rest of society, actually have adopted a far more reasonable and sensible line. And that is that this is a deeply offensive film, but it's a film that is unworthy of such a reaction on our part. The best thing to do with this kind of trash is to trash it. But at the same time, there has been a message sent to the West. Listen, you can't keep doing this. First and foremost, we must realize that this puts us here in the West in a conundrum. It puts us in a place where we have to start asking the very ideals, the very fundamentals which we proclaim we are built upon. Issues of freedom and equality and the such. And now our relations with the part of the world that we cannot do without is at risk because
do you believe,
something
though,
like
the
this.
point I'm trying to make, though, do you believe that the West, in co-opting the Muslim Brotherhood, and the West in its colonial history has co-opted groups which have then been discredited?
I disagree with that. I think that like Seumas said, basically the United States and the majority of the West just woke up and saw a reality which is it's been trying to deny for decades. For this government here in our country, I mean, for decades we've been hearing that no, the Islamists are just a nuisance minority. They don't really matter in society. Now that we have the ballot box, it's proven that actually they make up the majority of these societies. So now they've been they've been put in a place where they have to deal with the reality.
No, but I mean, Sara, Silvestri, I mean, let me bring you in here. I mean, there isn't just one Islamist voice, though, is there? I mean, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood has been very cautious over Camp David agreement and foreign policy. Do you see some of these issues emerging from the internal debates regarding the results of this film? Not to do with the film itself, of course, which everyone condemns, but what might emerge afterwards?
I mean, the different position taken by the Salafists and by the Muslim Brothers in relation to the movie, to me, doesn't tell me so much something about the serious intentions of the Salafis, of this or that other group to deliberately attack and the West and so on. But it tells me a lot about the inexperience of political groups that have not yet taken part in the complex dynamics of political processes in a democratic context, and are in a way naive and able to be manipulated by those people like this guy in America who have a particular agenda and are trying deliberately to stir certain emotions. So I think there is so many unknowns about the outcomes and the transformations of the Arab world that although I am particularly sad by this event and by how certain groups within the Muslim world have behaved, I would actually support the position of Altikriti that actually overall, yes, society is changing very slowly, and the transformation has to take time with time, as things have to be matured, things have to be digested, and so how even people respond to the media products. This has to change with democracy.
Yeah, when you talk about democracy, I mean, there will be viewers who believe that, you know, implanting a Western model of democracy, which is in effect what's happened, is not really authentic to true Islamic values. Seumas Milne, I mean, do you see that in any way becoming an issue as to what sort of Islamism the Middle East should have, as that being perhaps the primacy of debate in coming years?
I mean, I wouldn't see it as implanting a Western model in the region. I mean, obviously there are some Muslims and some Salafists, who, maybe most Salafists, who would reject democratic politics as anti-Islamic. But I mean, that's not the majority view in the Muslim world, and it's not the majority view in what's called Islamism. I mean, I think in a way that argument, I mean, Anas would know better than me, but that argument's been had within the Islamist tradition over the last generation or more, and I think the clear majority view and the place where we are now, which is, you know, at the heart of the Arab awakening or the Arab uprisings, is an understanding that, you know, democratic politics is not inimical to Islam or what the Islamist goals are.
Well,
and I think, you know, that's what we're seeing played out. I mean, there's whole other issue about how people want to react to that, both from outside the region and internally.
But I mean, that debate may have been had, Seumas Milne, but I mean, Anas Altikriti, I mean, in a sense, though, it is still there, that debate, isn't it? And after all, you know, the Islamic parties are now accepted, in a way, the colonial nation states that were drawn on a map by Britain and France, and all the problems surrounding that. And when we look at Syria, Lebanon, you know, these are really questioned as to what they are. So, you know, do you think that, as it were, more extreme, to use that word, perhaps, ideas might gain traction if the present group of Islamists, led by the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, don't sort of manage to sort things out in their countries?
I think it's reasonable to give people time. Let's not forget that these societies have just emerged from tyrannical regimes that have, you know, been brutalizing these countries and these societies for more than a generation. In the case of Egypt, for 30 years. In the case of other countries, you know, for far more than that. People have to start from somewhere. And the model of, you know, democratic politics is possibly a good platform to start off from. After that, nations need to, within the scope of time and space and ability to think and the such, need to come and see how they can remold this to suit their own culture, their own heritage, their own values, their own religion, faith, their own ideals, whatever they come collectively to see as appropriate to them. This needs time. I mean, we can't demand of them to move from 0 to 60 in I don't know, 3 or 4 seconds. We need to give them time. I think that till now, particularly in the case of Egypt, maybe to a lesser extent in the case of Tunis, we are seeing some very, very positive outcomes from these earlier days. Of course there are problems, and there will be more problems, but at least now we have people who can think for themselves, who are free to debate, who are free to discuss, who can come up with new ideas. They had none of that in the past. I think we should afford them time.
Coming to the end, Dr. Sara Silvestri, just a word from you then on your view of the legacy of this film. Do you think that it will blow over in that sense, and we will, as Anas is suggesting here, we will, in a way, have a progression towards greater democracy and indeed greater Islamic nature of these societies, but that actually will not be in any way damaged by this film?
Well, definitely there are lessons learned from the negative episodes that we've witnessed in relation to this film. I hope that the film won't have a legacy. Good movies normally have a good legacy, and they're watched and they're recorded and they're taught in university and so on. This movie, actually, I wonder how many people have seen it, and I hope people will learn from, you know, the violence that has been caused to many people, not to repeat this, and that they will go back to taking as a point of reference actually the core values of their religion, and not the you know, the personal devious ideas of individual people who are deliberately trying to harm society in general. That I always hope that people will start looking at the common good. Okay,
Dr. Silvestri, I'm sorry, we're going to wrap up there. Thank you so much. But I think, as Anas Altikriti said, if two sides are equal, then perhaps in a way sensitivities will be less on matters such as this. Well, a big thank you to our guests and our production team, but most of all to you at home for watching. Now, don't go away. Coming up next, your views on the news. Let us know what you think about this film. Assam Siddiqui, the chairman of the City Circle, will be here, as well as Sheikh Shams Adoua, the founder of Ibrahim College. Well, next week I'll be back with another look behind the global headlines in the world this week. Meanwhile, bye-bye. Assalamu alaikum.